Welcome to our Equal Features Network Incubator on Closing the Gap, Intersectional Perspectives for Realizing Economic Justice in Canada. I'm so excited to listen to the incredible speakers we have participating in this session, and I just want to say thank you again for joining us, and a huge extra big thank you to all the panelists for sharing their insights and wisdom with us today. Before we get into the panel today, I'll just do a little bit of brief housekeeping and introductions. My name is Erin Jex. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Manager of Strategic Partnerships for Gender Equality here at the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, also known as CanWatch. And the Equal Features Network is an important initiative that we launched in December 2020. So we're fairly new, but really excited to see and engage with kind of the growth of all the organizations over the course of the past 2 years. The Equal Features Network is a free membership that brings together local, regional, national, international organizations who are working to advance GE, gender equality, and social justice in their communities. So we're currently at over 500 members, 511 to be specific. And these incubator sessions are important opportunities to bring the membership together, to learn more about pertinent issues affecting the GE community, to share knowledge and build ideas into partnerships. So thank you all for being here to be a part of the process with us today. I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Wendat Niuwensohio peoples, who are the traditional guardians of the land where I live and I work. I acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, and I pay respect to all the Indigenous people from across this region and across Turtle Island. So thank you for listening to that little bit of information. I'm really happy to move on and introduce our impressive panelists with you today. So joining us, we have Abigail Isaac, who has recently completed her final year studying political science and economics at the University of Alberta. It is there where she conducted research at the nexus of gender justice, migration justice, and climate justice. This experience set the foundation for her professional aspirations, which are rooted in a commitment to reimagining the protections afforded to the most marginalized in the international asylum system through policy change and advocacy. Currently, she works as a researcher and consultant examining resource gaps for racialized immigrants and refugees seeking work in Canada. We also have Allison Venditti joining us. So Allison is a career coach, human resources, and return to work expert with over 15 years of experience creating programs, policy, and best practices that improve workplace cultures and increase employee retention. After becoming a mother and surviving a life-altering brain injury, Allison decided to leverage her expertise as a corporate recruiter for industries ranging from healthcare to banking to start a career coaching business to help women, and especially mothers, build meaningful careers and develop leadership skills to become change makers in their organizations. She has since grown her organization, Moms at Work, to Canada's largest professional networking for mothers, providing resources, community, and support to over 13,000 women. We have Magnolia Perrin joining us. Magnolia is the Indigenous Women and Youth Lead at the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. She holds a graduate diploma in Indigenous Policy and Administration from Carleton University and a master's in Indigenous Nationhood at the University of Victoria, where she focused on entrepreneurship and economic development in Indigenous communities. Magnolia has experience in advocacy, research, policy, and program development, and has worked with many Indigenous nonprofit organizations, including the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers and the First Nations Information Governance Center. Magnolia is from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory and a proud member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. We have also Nancy Wilson joining us, who is the founder and CEO of the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce, the only chamber of commerce in Canada that specifically represents and advocates for women-identified and non-binary business owners in Canada. Nancy is a chartered professional accountant with over a decade of accounting and finance experience in the private sector. Prior to CanWCC, she ran an accounting and advisory firm specializing in women business owners and entrepreneurs. After experiencing a lack of resources, difficulty finding connection, and numerous barriers, both as a business owner and indirectly through her clients, Nancy launched the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce in January 2018. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Sophia Jacob joining us. Sophia is an award-winning experienced event planner, marketing strategist, and community organizer with specialties in fundraising for nonprofit organizations and brand promotion for small businesses. Sophia is a navigator and relationship broker. Ooh, I love that. I'm gonna steal that one for my own bio, Sophia. Sophia is the president of Sophia J Events, which is a boutique event planning and marketing firm that provides consulting services, social media, PR communications, coordination, logistics, brand awareness, and acts as a liaison for B2B relations and strategic partnerships for small businesses and nonprofit organizations. In 2018, Sophia founded the Canadian Women of Color Leadership Network, which is a grassroots organization that is led by women of color who want to see more women of color and non-binary people reflected in board of director positions, C-suite, and leadership roles with decision-making influence. So, quite an impressive group of people that we have on the panel with us today. So now that I've done a bit of introductions, and panelists, please feel free to add anything to what I have shared about you already. I'm really excited to kind of dive in and get to some of the questions that we have for you today. So really, the kind of purpose of bringing people together around this topic today is because we recognize that around the world, women in all their diversity perform the most underappreciated work, earn less than cisgender men, do more unpaid care and care work, and this results in them bearing the brunt of the widening wealth gap. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, which has further exacerbated these issues, we have seen an unprecedented economic crisis, which has hit the poorest, most vulnerable, and marginalized communities the hardest. In particular, women, racialized, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and members from the 2S LGBTQ+ communities are the most at risk to experiencing the effects of a global recession and are already at a place of disadvantage due to the existing systemic barriers to equitable participation in the global economy. While there has been some progress, there is still some critical work that needs to be done so that these communities can really achieve their full potential. So with that little bit of introduction, I'm gonna kind of turn the floor over to Nancy first and just ask you, why is economic equity important to you? And what impacts does it have for your work and for the communities that you work with?
Thank you, Erin. I'm so pleased to be here and to share the virtual stage with this panel of experts and women. So economic equity is the foundation of the advocacy that the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce, or CanWCC, which is what we call it as a short form, the foundation of the advocacy that CanWCC does on behalf of our members, because ultimately everything tracks back to economic equity. And it as an issue, it is so broad and permeates sort of so many things and issues and other topics that it can seem, like a mountain and too much to really tackle all at once. And it is too big to tackle all at once. But the way that I organize it in my mind is at different sort of levels of a system. So at the systemic level, we have gender norms, social, the social pieces that prevent economic equity, policies and legislation that hold us back from having parity, and that's really where CanWCC lives, is really fighting for systemic policy equity issues, and I'll maybe later on I'll be able to touch on some of those. And then there's this middle area, which is the organizations and businesses and how they contribute positively or negatively to economic equity. And that is a critical piece. So our businesses you know, implementing pay equity? Are they treating their employees, you know, in a way that is fair? Are they paying them a living wage? And for our members, women entrepreneurs, are they creating a culture that is going to create more companies that are doing those positive things? And it's really those organizations and businesses, small businesses in particular in Canada, because over 96% of Canada and is made up of small businesses. So it's really going to be those businesses and decisions made at the senior level of those businesses that's going to drive the change we want to see. But ultimately, businesses are not, conscious entities of their own. They're run by individuals. So then at the bottom level, we see individuals. So how can we change the minds or convince individuals to make decisions that will drive economic equity? And we can see that some folks are simply not interested in what they perceive to be giving away their power to others. And so we need to find solutions to to shift minds, to change people's minds, and to whether that is punitive or incentivize those changes. So I think that if we think about those three levels and how they interact, the systemic, organizational, and individual level, that's also sort of plays out in who we have on our panel as well. They can speak to those different levels of the impact of economic equity.
Thank you, Nancy. I think that set this question up really well for what's following. And I think maybe Allison, I'll throw it to you next, just knowing some of the kind of advocacy at that individual and organizational level that you do. So maybe you can answer kind of why is economic equity important to you and some of the impacts you're seeing from your work in this space.
I find the discussion around economic equity inaccessible. So I find that we're talking about it at levels which individuals feel disconnected from. They don't understand the language, they're disengaged. People are not willing to start with people where they're at. So Moms at Work has, so my advocacy background comes specifically from disability, which means that I identify, I'm disabled. I can't read. I have no use of my left arm. I am, and I see that a lot of the work is done up here, and it's very gatekeeped. There's a lot of gatekeeping happening, so that everybody else can't be a part of these movements. They're not included in feminism. They're not included in these things. So when we're talking about tiers, I view people at the top. I don't give a shit about federal thing if it doesn't do, sorry, I shouldn't say that. If it's not impacting the individuals. So when we talk about economic justice, and I was for me, DEI, I'm in a corporation, unless you're talking about money and unless you're planning to pay Black women and marginalized communities the money, I'm uninterested in your workshop or safe space sticker. I'm do the work. This is a workplace. You're paid to be there. Pay people what they're worth. So I look at advocacy as a totally different bucket. We will get there. Moms at Work has done work on pay transparency legislation. I'm a big supporter of what's happening in the States, and I write policy for them. But it means nothing unless you have an empowered base who understands what the hell you're talking about, right? And no one is paying attention when I'm talking about pay equity, pay transparency, and I'm not identifying what those things are and how it impacts you, right? As an individual. So that's where we come at it, is I'm not going to talk above you or around you. I'm going to talk directly to you as a single mother who's making $29,000 a year, and the things that we can do to help you today, not 20 years from now.
No, that's great. And I think maybe this kind of going to throw this over to Magnolia, because you do a lot of work in Indigenous community. And as Allison has just kind of said, like those people who are not empowered, they're kind of left outside of these conversations. So kind of what does that look like in your work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin, and really appreciate you, Stacey, setting the stage for this conversation. It's funny, when I think of economic equity, of course, it's very important to me as a woman and as an Indigenous woman, but I just had the privilege to spend the last 2 days at the Indigenomics She conference here in Vancouver. And the founder and CEO of Indigenomics, Carol Ann Hilton, she speaks about how we can unlock the $100 billion Indigenous economy. And so I'll talk a little bit about, what that looks like for my work with NACA. And so our mandate is to support Indigenous business development and support economic development within Indigenous communities across Canada. So of course, economic equity is really at the core of what we do. And we support a membership of over 58 Indigenous owned and controlled financial institutions that provide developmental lending to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit entrepreneurs across Canada. Many of these entrepreneurs who otherwise wouldn't be served by mainstream financial institutions, often because we are considered too high risk for a variety of reasons, many of which are a result of our colonial history here in Canada and policies that still exist today. And so our network, we're able to do, specialized risk assessment. We offer a lot more business support and capacity development for the entrepreneurs and businesses that we support. And so, we're able to provide loans and financing options to Indigenous businesses, that really contributes to economic equity in Canada. And so it's just to put this in perspective, from April 2020 to March 2021, our network provided over or nearly 1,000 business loans valuing over $100 million to Indigenous businesses across Canada. And as a result of that, those businesses that were supported were able to create or maintain over 3,800 full-time equivalent jobs. And so by us being able to help businesses start up or expand or grow, they're creating jobs in their community, which is then contributing to Canada's GDP. And there's also so many social impacts through the work that we do, and just generally through economic equity. And we're seeing that, that it improves the whole kind of community health and well-being. And one of the things that we spoke about this week at the conference I was at was around dignity. And it really comes back to closing that dignity gap that many Indigenous and other underserved groups who are left out of these discussions or left out of economic development. And so, if we're able to support them and restore that dignity, that we're doing so much. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and love to hear from others.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Magnolia. And I think it's exactly that support and that kind of building relationships and that capacity strengthening work that you're doing through NACCA just sounds so incredible. And I'm so excited to unpack that more as we continue on this conversation. I think, Abby, maybe I'll throw it to you next. Just again, when we talk about communities that are kind of left on the outskirts of these types of conversations, I think youth are a big part of that. So through your work and kind of through what you're doing with the youth community and engaging them in kind of the economic conversation, why is economic equity important?
So a lot of the work that I do with involving youth in the conversation in economic equity comes from the National Collective of Women in Business, which is a network of young women from across 9 universities in Canada. And we come together to kind of distill all of our problems into specific advocacy claims that we can then put forward to representatives. And so my role in particular is to facilitate what we call advocacy circles, which are roundtables between MPs from across the country and young women. And I think I second a lot of what Allison said in terms of talking about where people are at personally. I think a lot of folks, especially young folks, don't necessarily feel entitled to the space of like the advocacy space, period. And so a lot of the work that we do is affirming that they know what their needs are more than a lot of politicians do. And in fact, the conversation should be reversed. It's like, you should be the one who's taking up space here, telling them what should be changed because you are experts in your own experience and you're experts in the change that needs to happen. And shifting that power dynamic. And I think that's where it starts, because the first step is for themselves thinking, oh, I deserve better. Like, I deserve more options. And so when I think of economic equity, I mean, it's just, for me, code for social mobility. And what that means is, like, do you have choices? Or what choices don't you have? And do you have the ability to shape your life into something where you're doing work that you're passionate about and that you're proud of? And if you don't, why? And a lot of the barriers that we're seeing are, as I think a lot of other panelists said, identity related. So they're racialized and they're gendered and they're related to ability and to queerness and to citizenship status. And so it's layered. And as an organization, I think the way I see us is just kind of a vessel for the true experts in the conversation, which are the young people or the people who are in the workplaces, for they themselves to kind of be in those spaces and to be advocating for themselves directly to representatives. And so I think it's challenging to think about economic equity because it's true, like Nancy said, it is layered and there is that systemic side of things that is part of the work that our organization does with kind of the larger advocacy pieces. But what I found is the harder work to do is addressing the people individually and they themselves finding that, I know what I'm talking about, and I should be in a position to demand better for myself and for the communities that I come from.
Thank you so much, Abby. And Sophia, I think, again, another really great segue into some of the work that you're doing through the Canadian Women of Color Leadership Network and seeing some of that change happening by working with and creating opportunities for Black women and racialized women to be in those positions of power so that they can be the change in these organizations and in these kind of positions of power. So I would love to hear kind of your perspective on the importance of economic equity through the work that you're doing.
So lots. Thanks so much for having us here. So some of the work that we've been doing, we've expanded. We've added pillars to our organization over the years, which is under wellness, economic development, leadership, and community partnerships. And that's a big piece for us, the community partnerships, to be able to help us build forward and empower the organization, but also empower the people that are, in the network with us. When we're talking about organizationally, we've seen a lot of barriers. People don't want to fund nonprofit organizations that look like ours, who we're telling them that we want to be empowering others and empowering folks who look like us to get to the C-suite or they have a trucking business, they want to run a daycare. We want to be able to empower everybody. But if you're not going to help us build our operation and you're creating a barrier for us, it's unacceptable. So we've lived somewhat off of grants and somewhat off of when people are just giving private donations. But in the granting space, it is not equitable at all. There's a lot of classism and a lot of barriers. And I've had to tell big organizations, you need to get out of the king's seat. You're not making room for organizations like mine. And I'm not happy with you right now. You're going to deny us things like $3,000. Why? You are a multi-million-dollar charity, and you're only dealing with other charities. So some charities are saying, if you don't have charitable status like us, we're not going to deal with you. I'm sorry. That means you're lying to the grassroots and the small nonprofit community, which we reside from, which we were birthed out of, right? I had my son at 18 years old. So I resonate with you, Allison. I had my son at 18 years old. So all the systemic issues that could come at me were placed on my head from early. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start an organization like this is to give back to women who are coming up from those spaces, to actually build and open the doors, right? Create that sponsorship where you're pulling up your sisters. But organizations like that or charities like that create that barrier for women who are founders like us. They create a barrier to say that we don't want to be helping or supporting or encouraging nonprofits like yours or businesses like yours. So there's a lot of systemic issues there. There's a lot of colonialism that's going on. And so a lot of these people who are around the table of big charities, who can hold these big dinners, big galas, and come together and, you know, oh, somebody's going to donate like $1.1 million. Well, have you looked at any of the Black organizations or Black and racialized organizations? Because some of the people in the room look like me, right? And you're not paying attention to them. A lot of the Black organizations, if you look at Black organizations in the ecosystem of nonprofit, I think we're only getting 5% of the dollar that is being donated to the nonprofit sector. They are overlooking us, not treating us well, and it's not equitable. So we're out there also fighting that too. We're also asking, why are you overlooking Black and racialized nonprofits? Why are you overlooking Black and racialized women who are founders of business or nonprofit organizations? How is the charity sector also going to be, you know, have those systemic barriers when it shouldn't? There should be no systemic barriers in a space that's asking for charity, that's asking for support. So we have that fight too, and we continue to create opportunities for wellness. We continue to create opportunities for training and education. We've got great directors in the space doing the education and training, supporting women who come to the organization looking for support for various needs, particularly around mental health and wellness. It is big for us in our organization because of the systemic trauma that is still going on out there in the workplace, in the workforce, with nonprofits or with their own businesses or as moms. You know, so we have great therapists that are here supporting the folks who come to our doors. But again, we literally see that in and outside of our organization, you know, and we have to jump those hurdles. We don't want any colonialism. We're always trying to decolonize spaces that we go to. Even the wording, vice president, president, all of these, we do try not to use those terminologies. I know I have to write it down for that grant or that support, but when we're in our space, we don't use those words because it means nothing to us. It means nothing to the traditions and the cultures of our people. It means nothing to us. And so we want to ensure that we're always decolonizing the spaces, but also bringing empowerment to the folks who are coming towards us. But yeah, there's a lot of organizational systemic barriers out there. And then that filters down to the folks who we're trying to serve. And so, you know, there's that power, there's that shift in power that we're trying to change and bringing it more to the grassroots, more so than the people who are up in top level positions that not wanting to share the table. So I told them, you need to either be more equitable and be about the grassroots or get off the table. And I don't want to see you there no more. And then I kind of got off the call. So it was one of those days for me. I just was not feeling the best. And it was just too much at that point in time. So yeah, that's kind of where we are.
I love it. And I would love to be a fly on the wall for some of those conversations, you just bringing in the hard truth, Sophia, and I'm here for it. That is incredible. And yeah, I'm hearing a lot from our work with members, you know, around some of these barriers that really almost make the work that they're doing a non-starter. You know, we have some youth organizations, you know, if you're under 18, you can apply for, you know, charitable status or nonprofit status. And it's like, you know, so it's actually our Girls Belong Here participant from last year from the Plan International Canada program. She was like, well, I founded my organization, like I run it. I shouldn't have to ask my mom to, you know, fill out my grant for me or fill out my application for me just so I can have this, you know, status so that I can receive funding or to kind of be invited to the table. So thank you for kind of kicking off that conversation there, Sophia, around some of the barriers that we're seeing through your work. Maybe Nancy, I can kind of throw it back over to you from that kind of systemic level. Like really, what are you seeing in terms of some of these really difficult barriers for, you know, organizations within your network and through the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that came up for me as I was listening to the rest of the panel speak just now is how some of these issues are so siloed, and they can't be really. I mean, we can't advance equity in one space and expect that to hold, to work, unless we're advancing equity across the board, you know? So I found during the pandemic, especially when I was out there talking to people and talking to government and stuff, it felt really strange to be saying, you know, we want to advance, you know, equality, equity, whatever, for women identified on and non-binary entrepreneurs, and not to include, you know, the issues of racism and you know, reconciliation and all these other issues in there. Because, you know, if we just look at gender equality, or, you know, racial equality, or this issue or that issue, I'm not going to say it's meaningless, but we can't do it piecemeal. It just won't work. So breaking down silos, I think, is a big issue. And I think one of the ways that that we are sort of prevented from making progress is this sort of pitting people against each other. And within the nonprofit world, you know, it's, here's a bunch of money, folks, now go and fight for it, you know? So how are we going to work together as a collective if we're all fighting for the last penny? You know, that we're set up to be adversarial. So that's what I was thinking about. And I do think that as a group, as a movement, and not just a women's movement, but sort of an economic equity movement, if we came together on issues that we absolutely agree on, we could actually make change, because we would just barrel in and say, we're not going to put up with this shit anymore. It's not going to happen. And there's enough of us with enough force and enough expertise at all of those three levels that the government would have to make changes, and the private sector would have to make changes. The private sector is only going to listen to a mass of people, because the only thing that ultimately the corporations care about is profit, and they only make a profit when customers en masse do something, whether it's boycotting or whatever. So in terms of barriers that I see, I think pay equity it has to be dealt with, because it is so symbolic. If pay equity isn't implemented across the board, what we're saying without pay equity is we do not value women's labor or as much as we value men's. And without that, without valuing one person's labor as equal to another person's labor, how can we expect equity in any other space? It just doesn't make sense. So I think pay equity is a root barrier and has to be dealt with in order for to make any advances. And then I think that you know, there are pieces of legislation that and policies that directly bias that are directly biased towards men, and you know, they create a situation where women on average are always poorer than men. And I appreciate what Allison is saying, like, about, you know, speaking to the individual and not sort of saying, you know, here's all this reading material, here's another job to do. but I think that that's why we have organizations like CAN WCC or Sophia's organization or Abby's organization or NACA. I would rather tell individuals like, look, this is a situation, you know it because you're living the consequences of it. The RSP legislation, for example, totally biases men and screws women out of a healthy retirement income. It does this very specifically. I can tell you all about it if you want, because I'm a big tax nerd. I know nobody wants to hear about it. Don't stand next to me at a party. But you don't have to hear about it. You just we are going to do the heavy lifting for you. And I want to broaden the concept of what advocacy looks like. Advocacy looks like getting up every day and running your business, because that's really damn hard. But as a woman running a business every day, you're contributing to the solution. You are part of the advocacy effort. So you do that and you're helping that way. And I'll write up new policy around RSP calculations, and I'll take that to government. That's how we're going to work together. I think I went a little bit off topic there, but that's my answer. That's my final answer.
No, thank you. I think that really shed some insight onto some of the things that I don't think people necessarily recognize about this conversation around economic equity, and like the very targeted and diverse ways in which women and other, marginalized communities are really up against what they're up against in terms of what solutions are going to look like. And I think, Allison, I could see you smiling there a little bit when we were talking about nonprofits, and you kind of have some unique insights from your own work that I would love to unpack.
Somebody mentioned pitch contests. So let me be very clear that nobody said to Shopify, hey, we're going to give you $100,000 and do a pitch contest, right? Pitch contests, mentorship, galas. That's what they like to give women money to. It's hush money. It's shut up and do something that doesn't do anything money. Moms at Work has specifically, and I said this to 100 people, we are not a non-for-profit. I'm a woman with a business. You cannot take that from me. You cannot take that from me. That is economic equity. I am allowed to run a business, make money, and hand that intergenerational wealth down to my children, not to put on a non-for-profit and it's used to silence women. So every time we get into a room, I'm getting into a room with Walmart and said to them, absolutely effing not, maybe work on your union busting. And they were like, I can say that because I don't have grant money that gives me a 28-page document of the things I'm not allowed to say, right? You're not allowed to say this about whatever. We meet with politicians all the time, the same way other developers meet with them, other business owners meet with them. I am contributing to the economy. I have a staff. I pay taxes. That is who politicians listen to. And so I was like, why would I give that up? Why, as a disabled woman who would then report to a board that could take my company away from me, why would I do that? It doesn't make any sense. So we've fought hard that businesses can do good in this world, that you can run a business and be an advocate, that you can run a business, make money, and still make change. And just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean it can't happen. The other thing that we do is I get the hell out of people's way. When abortion rates are at risk, Moms at Work stands behind Abortion Rights Canada. I give them money. I fund the people who are fundamentally the better people to do that work. Why the hell would I compete with them for that money? I get behind them. Once we remove those barriers, I don't know anything about the RSP stuff, but I sure as hell would stand behind Nancy and say, they're working on it, let's move together. Because this sort of infighting isn't created by us. And it isn't really created by money. It's this sort of lack of, every time I'm in a women's group, they're like, do you know I have any grants? Do you know? I'm like, stop writing grants. Just find something that makes money, right? Because the amount of time we're spending for a $3,000 grant isn't even we're not even making minimum wage. So I was like, so they've figured it out. We're sitting over here fighting for the scraps. And in the meantime, we're not able to do the advocacy work. So I really view it as shut up money. We've applied for grants. We've done all this stuff. And then it really caps. I don't want to run a mentorship program. I'm 41 years old. I don't need a mentor. I know exactly what I'm doing, right? I don't want a pitch contest. I'm like, I want to run my business. So that's where we sit as moms at work. And I have fought tooth and nail that I'm like, I will not give up my business just because I'm doing something good in the world. That doesn't mean I can't exist. And really, that's been my sort of thing. So moms at work will never touch galas. We will never touch pitch contests. We will never touch mentorship. And every time people email us about that, I give my stock answer that this is why, and they're trying to silence you. So make a choice, but please go find another mentor for 6 weeks because that'll really make the change.
Yeah, you're getting some action in the chat, Allison, and some hearts from the panelists. I think that's a wonderful kind of maybe lead into asking Magnolia. You did share a little bit about some of the barriers, but kind of similar to what we were just discussing, in that these systems are in place that are really, impacting Indigenous owned businesses from being successful. So kind of in your opinion, and from the work that you're doing, like, how are you kind of touched on some of the granting and some of that, maybe granting is not the right word in that, but some of the money that you have from the organization that is being given to these Indigenous owned organizations. But how else are you seeing like that, the work that you're doing, like subverting this system? I think there's a lot to be said of, you can't decolonize a colonial system. So how do you work within that?
Yeah, to be honest, my head is spinning. Like, I want to respond to so many things Nancy and Allison said. So just wanted to acknowledge, I certainly agree with Nancy around, we certainly do feel like we're working in silos, and especially as an Indigenous organization, like we need allies, and we need people who are going to support us and stand up behind us when Indigenous reconciliation isn't a priority for the government anymore. So, and likewise, where we can support, we want to do that as well. And I think that really, like what I was thinking about as both of you were speaking was around the whole kind of topic of intersectionality, like, and especially at my role with NACA, working on our women and youth programming, we're talking about Indigenous entrepreneurs who face systemic racism and discrimination barriers every day. And then we look at our Indigenous women and other further marginalized groups within the businesses that we support. And so it makes sense that we work with organizations like CanWCC, who are doing all of this advocacy work for women too. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And then the other thing I wanted to, I guess that was resonating with me as Allison was speaking around this concept of like hush money. And I think for us, it's about controlling the narrative too. Like, a lot of people think, or there's, stereotypes or narratives out there like Indigenous people get free money. And it's like, wait a minute, this is not a handout. So we need to correct that narrative, because first off, the work we're doing, we are lenders, and Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs have every right to access funding to build and grow businesses that are then not only supporting their families and their communities, but contributing to the greater society. So really wanted to acknowledge that. But I think, just generally, like some of the barriers we see Indigenous entrepreneurs facing, I mean, of course, I kind of talked about being perceived as high risk, often because they're sole proprietorships, and generally to just being able to have the equity to invest in their businesses. And then, of course, the fact that they reside in often more rural or remote communities, and they're geographically far from financial services or customer bases or suppliers and that sort of thing. And then the lack of business infrastructure in communities. We see that too around reliable internet. And then, of course, there's more systematic issues like pertaining around Indigenous businesses who are operating on reserve, and the Indian Act, and how they can't even use their property as collateral to access capital, or just barriers and challenges around membership and identity and that sort of thing. So, as Indigenous financial institutions, like, we really work to support entrepreneurs. And that's why we're developmental lenders, so we can do those loans that otherwise wouldn't be provided, and we have workarounds for some of those other barriers. And then we know, even just looking at it from a gender lens, we know that our Indigenous women face even more barriers, particularly with access to capital, whether it's around, having the proven credit history or being able to participate full-time in their business, because many of them maybe are doing this part-time, side hustle, home-based type business, or they're balancing so many different responsibilities with their family and community and their business. So then there's also just outright sexism and gender bias that they face within financial institutions as well. So we're really trying to, with our women's program, and just connecting this back to Allison's point around hush money again, right? Like, we've built out a program where yes, there's support there in terms of having a dedicated business support officer to work with them on their business, provide that advisory support, mentorship, do workshops and training. But at the end of the day, we know that the top challenge for Indigenous women is access to capital. And so the most important part in terms of building out our program was to develop a microloan fund for women entrepreneurs that they could access so that they could start and grow their business. So it was really about having access to capital and then providing some of that wraparound support, which I think is so important for helping our entrepreneurs succeed.
I'm just going to jump in and say the fact that that the term you use, access is not how granting is. It's like, if you put all these issues on how they're allowed to use that money, it stifles creativity, and then you're not respectful of the groups to be able to govern their own decisions about that. It takes away all of that, and it feels so gross. So the way that microlending in that works is so much more equitable, way you have set it up, that yes, you should have those other things, but what Nancy and me were what we're talking about is these, the big Loblaws $2 million, and then it comes with 16 pages of how exactly you can use it and what exactly you're saying. I'm like, is that really useful? No. What you guys are doing, it's let us help you. That granting feels like, let us help you, but right?
And I love kind of the idea behind the wraparound support, right? It's not just here is something, we're here to support you, to walk you through it, to connect you, to help these, oh, Nancy, good one, golden handcuffs, yes. But to build these partnerships. So like Nancy and Allison were talking about, so that, someone who's leading the charge in a particular way, we can get behind them and let them do the job that they're best at. And I think really in kind of thinking through solutions, this kind of idea of holistic partnership models is really something that is going to be really helpful when we're, talking about advancing economic equity. Maybe Abby, I'll turn it over to you. Can you share through your work and, through your experience in this area, are you seeing some progress through the communities that you're engaging with? What does that look like? If not, what is, kind of gold star for you in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to gauge, and this is something that I was going to bring up, and that I guess my question is progress for who? Because even when we are talking about gender equity, that's not a monolithic group of people that we're speaking about. Are we talking about cis women? And if so, are we talking about cis white women, cis, women of color? Are we talking about trans folks? Are we talking about non-binary people? Are we talking about other genderqueer people? And that's just within the gender kind of label that I guess we've all been referencing. And so I do struggle sometimes to just say has progress happened? And I do think also in relation to the pandemic. Now I'm hesitant to say that we're in a period of pandemic recovery, but I do think that in some ways economically people are trying to get back to normal. And there's a series of additional barriers that exist, barriers to economic equity that have been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic that has set folks who were already previously disadvantaged back a series of steps. So, and I don't want to sound pessimistic. It's not I don't think it's possible, but I do think now that there are things that have been highlighted as a result of the pandemic that show us that, you know, more work needs to be done than maybe we thought previously. But I do think, I mean, at least in relation to the work that NCWIB is doing, we're seeing a willingness from politicians to directly engage with the people that they represent. And I'm not speaking about all politicians. And one of the barriers that I was going to speak on previously for youth was that a lot of them are political. I don't think that there are a lot of you know, folks in leadership roles who think that, you know, young people make up like a working population, even if they do, and participate actively in the economy, particularly in like the service industry, which was, you know, disproportionately impacted over the pandemic. So yeah, this isn't a straight answer, and I'm not sure if I can give one, because again, I think I need to be really specific about the group of people that I'm talking about. And so, yeah, I'm hesitant to say that women broadly have seen a lot of progress, but I do think that there is a willingness to maybe speak about these issues more publicly that gives me hope. I think at least that we're articulating needs and labeling issues when we see them. And I think that in the first place, the willingness to identify problems and barriers is in itself, you know, pointing us in a direction of progress. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
I just want to jump in really quick.
Yeah.
If I could just jump in really quickly. Yeah, I agree with you, Abby. Right now, I think where we are, our gold star is just to sustain where we are and kind of hold on. The pandemic has really wiped away a lot of things, particularly for Black and racialized women and femmes. And we just need to sustain and hold on where we are right now, bringing people and giving them access to digital equity, and the spaces that we hold in our virtual programming and our in-person programming is what we can do right now, just to say we're sustaining, we're holding the line, and that is it. And then going back to the nonprofit piece, when I said I was going to be taking any dollars from these people, the caveat was, if you have a problem with what I say or what I do out there and you want to wipe away your money, you've got to walk, because I may say something that you might not like. And if you don't like it, I will walk the road alone, because I started the organization by myself and I brought on people. We don't, like I said, we don't have that colonialistic way of working as a nonprofit with a board. I do have a board, but we don't work the way, no, we're just going to rip her down because she's a blah, blah, blah. Nope. I will walk the road alone, and I will take back my baby and walk when I need to, just for the simple fact, because I want to make sure that everybody equitably is in the space working together. There's no leader of nothing, chair of blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really exist here. We just have to do it because that's what it says on paper. But otherwise than that, if you need to take back your dollars, fine, I'll go back, because we work in the grassroots space anyways, and those are who our partners are, more so than the larger organizations. And then just going back to right now, people with the pandemic, all we can do is hold the line. Really, just because of mental health issues and what's happening in the mental health sphere, and just trying to, you know, put that into a space of getting help, getting well, dealing with the trauma of on not only on just the mental health issues, but what else has on top of that, past traumas, traumas from various, you know, systemic barriers, systemic issues, anti-Black racism, all of it. We just have to hold the line there and actually just continue to support at the level we are. Because right now, with food insecurity, underemployment for youth, over policing of our youth, all of it, it's really building this space of where's the shift going? It seems like it's going downhill, and all we can do is hold the line on where we are and let no more bridges break. And where we want to go is continue to build collaborations and partnerships across the country with people who look like us and who are aligned with what we're saying. So just holding the line. That is as much as we can do right now to give access and accessibility to the folks who are going to be a part of the network. And then when the light shines again, not to say that light is not shining, but when that door of access opens again, where we see there's a breakthrough happening here, we can all go holding hands together. Because like Nancy said, I think right now where we need to go is, you know, coming together in collaborations. That is your best way to build up collaborations. Don't deny anybody collaboration, find an alignment and walk the road together.
That's some wonderful sentiment there, Sophia. And I think, I'm jotting down keywords and things that are coming through. And I think I'm hearing that like a lot about this partnership, this breaking down silos, this collective understanding of kind of the struggle across all of the work that we're doing, and the idea of power in numbers, right? Really kind of bringing folks together around these key issues and, advancing them at kind of all of the levels of the work that we're doing. And I think, Abby, just in response to your note around progress, I really like that. And I think, maybe in thinking and reframing, instead of progress, we should be thinking more of steps towards positive change. Because you're right, I think, again, progress can be a little bit of an exclusionary concept, especially around like who is the beneficiary or who is benefiting the most. And generally speaking, it is usually, not racialized or Black or Indigenous communities, or to us LGBTQ communities. It's a bit more of the status quo. So we've had some really amazing questions come through the chat. So we're about an hour into the panel. We have about, 25-ish minutes left before wrap up. So I would maybe like to get to some of those, because I think the audience will really benefit from your collective wisdom here. So we had a question come through from PK around capitalism. So capitalism is considered by rad feminists and others as the linchpin of intersecting systems of oppression. So just talking, when are we going to tackle capitalism in our spaces with as much fervor as a pursuit of equality and DEI, and how? So that's kind of a really big question. Maybe I'll just open the floor, and folks who want to jump off mute on the panel, please feel free.
Yeah, this is such an interesting concept to me, or question, because I studied in Indigenous studies and governance at the University of Victoria, and I had a lot of interest in economic development. And this came up as almost like a point of conflict around capitalism is bad and not good for our communities. But then at the flip side, especially through economic development and entrepreneurship, there's also a way for us to achieve self-sufficiency. So we are not, as Indigenous nations, reliant on the federal government, and that we actually can be self-governing nations. So it's always really interesting to me. And so in the conversations that I have with Indigenous entrepreneurs, and particularly Indigenous women, and I can't remember who was talking about this earlier, but the idea of we can have businesses that align with our social and cultural goals, and that actually do contribute to the well-being of our community. So we see this a lot where Indigenous businesses or entrepreneurs, they almost have a social impact side to their business, whether they're donating a certain amount or percentage of their proceeds to charitable causes or to their communities, or that even just thinking kind of broader about some of the environmental impacts that their business has. And as Indigenous peoples, we in particularly in Haudenosaunee culture, we have the idea of 7 generation thinking. So anything we do today needs to have a really good impact on the future generations. And if it's not going to, then we shouldn't be proceeding. And so I see among Indigenous entrepreneurs that people hold that near and dear, and they're using their businesses as a way to make positive change in their communities. And a lot of their businesses are emerging because there's gaps in their communities, services that have been left unmet by government, and they're filling those needs. So I think the whole concept of Indigenous entrepreneurship and the way we define business actually really does challenge that notion of business equals capitalism. And in fact, we can, and even on an investing side of things, the businesses we choose to invest in, we can be very conscious and choose businesses that align with our personal values. And likewise, as consumers, we can choose who we purchase our products from. I will choose to purchase a product from an Indigenous business over Walmart any day, because I know that's contributing good. So that's kind of my take on it, but I'd love to hear what others have to say.
I'll jump in. I have a couple of thoughts, but not sort of a full coherent answer. So the first thing that I would say that comes to mind is people, I think it's a misconception that we are operating under like full, robust capitalism. And we definitely experience all of the sort of negative effects of capitalism, and some of the worst things out there, some of the worst behaviors of large corporations are certainly, you can follow that back to capitalist root philosophy. But when like conservatives or right wing or fans of capitalism talk about like what the fact that we live in a capitalist society, yeah, and they don't want this move to socialism, like panic, clutching pearls, that's not true. Like there is tons of government intervention in this so-called independent market. So really, I think that what we want to do is manage the type of government intervention in the market, and the amount and the type of government or government-like agencies, their involvement in the market, to a point where it's balanced in a way that we have systems to protect us as a whole from the most malicious potential effects of just pure greed, but still allows people to participate in the economy in a way that they I don't know. I like born and raised in a capitalist society. It's hard to think outside the box, right? So I still sort of see like, how can we still be in capitalism but like not be in capitalism? It's really difficult. So I think from my perspective, it's kind of like we need regulations. We need to like put a hold on the really extreme stuff that's going on, and when you look at climate change, like it's no longer like what regulations. It's like, no, like drastic things need to happen, or else we're not going to be having this conversation anymore. We're all going to be in bunkers, because it's just like the lucky ones of us will be in bunkers, right? What am I talking about? So then, okay. So then the last thing I think is a lot of the worst parts of capitalism really come down to like value for shareholder, right? So you have these publicly traded corporations, and they are able to do whatever they want because they say, look, the only thing we're responsible for is to increase value for our shareholders. So I think one of the things that we can do is broaden the concept of what value is for shareholders. So shareholders are human beings. So if human beings want to tackle climate change, then corporations doing less profitable things, but things that are good for climate change, that increases value to the shareholder. That's a philosophical idea that may take root.
Right, and I see Allison and both Abby are off mute, so maybe Abby, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say I wrestle with this question. It's something that we talk about a lot as a collective. For me, I mean, I think, we're in a late stage capitalist society where I do think we're witnessing actually the worst of what there is. And if we're not witnessing it in Canada, we're seeing it virtually everywhere else. And so I do struggle with this idea of like green capitalism, ethical capitalism, because I think it implies that in some way we can make it like work for us. And by us, I mean, those of us who didn't come up with the idea and continue to not benefit with it. And so I think that this was referenced in the chat, but to me, like capitalism is deeply related to white supremacy, to patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, like they're the same thing. And so I struggle still, and even, being part of something called the National Collective of Women in Business, I do think it's important to identify like who is the problem here. And it isn't like the everyday women who have their like small businesses and are trying to make a living for themselves, right? We're talking about the people who exploit others to make insane amounts of wealth that most of us, will can never dream of, still participating in a capitalist market. And so to that extent, like I think that that's evidence that capitalism doesn't it doesn't work. And I do think, that's a different question and a different conversation of like, how do we imagine alternatives? How do we think of a society where all of us can participate equitably? But yeah, my take on it is that, we are in the middle of the worst that it has to offer. I think the pandemic really made that clear. And B, especially speaking from a group that talks to a lot of young people, like when we're talking about things like the climate crisis, like that is a direct result of this like capitalist market strategy. And so there's no way to talk about quote unquote progress or positive change without also talking about what are we doing to address the roots of why this exists, which is, the way our market is set up, and capitalism, which again makes us talk about, like I said, racism, gender equity, etc. So yeah, I don't know. I struggle with the idea that we can like put reins on it and somehow like control it because I don't know that that's worked. And I think that that's, the evidence of that is the wealth gap that has grown and continues to grow. So maybe this is not to sound all like doom and gloom. I do think that there are scholars and activists who do imagine alternatives. And I think that that's a different conversation to have. But that is something that my collective is still kind of in the midst of reconciling with, particularly in conversation with young people who do have a lot of anxiety around the future that they're inheriting because of kind of the wreck that capitalism has made of our society. So yeah, that's my take. But Allison, please go ahead.
I'm gonna because every time I do these talks, I was like, it always goes into this, like, there's sort of big terms, nobody leaves with any sort of actionable thing. So I was like, I have two words called mutual aid, right? Like, and in the pandemic, we saw like vaccine hunters, right? These are just normal people coming together to help other people do these things, right? I am actively involved in mutual aid. You don't need to wait for government intervention. You set it up and you go. So if we're talking, like, a lot of these are long-term plans or whatever, I'm like, but you can do it now, right? They have one in New York in Washington Square. It's been running for years. Restaurants are involved, individuals are involved, so that is the important part of mutual aid. And we've seen these all over the internet, is like, someone needs $500, someone needs $200. Like, it works. People step up without this sort of like capitalistic intervention of like, you need 6 people in between to get the money to where it's supposed to go. And to me, that is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in action, is that, and it happens so fast. And I use vaccine hunters all the time as saying, I'm like, look, this is just a bunch of people who said there has to be a way to do this better. I'm going to do this after work and gain nothing personally from it. Like, you don't even know who these people are, and go out into the world. And so that is what I've put on my community, to be like, stop waiting for someone to allow you to make changes to make your community better. Go out and do it, right? And we see that with all sorts of things, but people need to feel compelled to move away from this sort of like exchange for gratitude, or exchange for, the plaque on the wall, or like, you can exchange it because you want to be a good human and you want to participate in the world, right? So that's where my kids are going. That's where I'm going. That's where other things are going. And we're doing them less and less through these massive organizations that are trying to like capitalize on caring for communities, right?
Thanks so much for sharing that, Allison. Sophia, did you have any thoughts kind of on this question, or Do you feel like what's been said kind of captures where your head is at?
No, what's been said, it captures where, yeah, I love what you said, Allison. You know, mutual aid is something that people should really pick up on, but we don't end up doing it because I don't know, we get caught in this system of like, oh my God, I think we need to attach ourselves to blah, 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 right? And then we just run off it on that. But I think, like I said before, we kind of have to just kind of hold where we are, hold the line, and figure out where we're going to be going to right now. There's not much more for me to kind of add to the conversation. It's where we are right now is it's, if it goes any worse or goes any more south, we're going to reach our breaking point, and then what do? We can't roll it back, and we're going to be in this state of chaos, and we're heading that way. We're almost in a state of chaos. So just where we are right now, we're kind of holding there and just continuing to kind of see where we can keep the care and keep hold of our communities and continue to care for our communities.
Thank you for that intervention. And we've got maybe time for one more question if there's somebody in the audience that wants to come off mute or post it in the chat. But there's also been some really amazing conversations happening in the chat, especially around some of the different intersections that economic equity has within different communities. Its influences and its impacts on gender-based violence, on the sex work community, things like that. So I think, we kind of focused more around kind of business, entrepreneurship, that kind of space. But I think as we think about economic equity, there are tenets of it that, for advancing gender equality more broadly, economic equity is definitely kind of an aspect that needs to be thought about and brought throughout all of our gender equality work. And then Jane just posted in the chat about mutual aid kick into gear in PEI after post-tropical storm Fiona, led mostly by young 2S LGBTQIA plus women and non-binary folk of color. Yeah, amazing. So haven't seen any kind of questions come through the chat or off mute. So maybe what I will do is I have a wrap-up question for everybody. We've got about 10 minutes left. So maybe everybody take about 2 minutes to kind of answer this question. And trying not to be, or maybe try to focus the question a little bit with more tangible. Like I think it was kind of funny this, we tend to think really big theoretically, but like let's maybe think about some tangible solutions. And I say that with a bit of a caveat, but like based on the conversations we've had today and with other panelists, like where do we go? Like, what is next for you in your work? What are you thinking about? And how are you thinking about moving forward? So what are some possible solutions? What are some possible next steps for positive change so that the gaps between those who are most impacted by these inequalities or these inequities can be addressed through the work that you're doing, through the partnerships that you're forming, through the thoughts that you're having in your head? And so maybe I'll go in reverse order and just have Sophia kick us off.
Sure. Where we're going as an organization is we're going to be continuing to creating a space of healing and wellness. We really have to continue that care. We're going to be bringing in more workshops to really pull in more people to have that understanding. And just, it's not only going to be people in various positions. It's going to be talking with community members and seeing where they're at and understanding what they need. Working with our partners who run food banks and run therapy sessions and run, still we're talking about COVID myth busting, public health. We're going to be talking with them. We're just going to be doing a lot of community care in that aspect, particularly, and childcare. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things that are affecting women and femmes right now in today's society, and to see where we can go as a collective. We can't do it without our community partners. And so we're just heading down that road for 2023 and just continuing to build our organization to build national partnerships. We're a national organization, and we want to broaden our partnerships to other national conversations? What are other organizations doing? Can we collaborate? What does partnerships look like with other organizations that are maybe doing something completely different that we can exchange on? So the exchange of information, knowledge, empowering each other's networks, and bringing those collaborations across the country, coast to coast to coast. I think that's the way we need to be able to have growth in our organizations, but also collectively do that collective caring, that collective wellness that needs to happen, broaden it across Canada. Because without it, I mean, we can't count on government to do it for us, and we can't count on these big institutions to do it for us. They've already failed us multiple times, and they just continue to do that, and they just continuously want to like step on us to be able to say, they can continue to climb higher to create a deeper divide between us. And so we as community members, grassroots organizations, grassroots groups coming together to collectively partner and, create that wellness space is where I think it needs to kind of happen. So partnerships is a big thing for us in collective wellness, and just moving towards that, collective wellness and being is what CWCLN is heading towards.
Thanks so much for sharing, Sophia. Abby, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things that NCUF is doing practically to move forward. One of them, I think Sophia touched on, is building partnerships. And that's been a big part of what our organization is working on right now, is creating connections with other organizations who have similar goals to amplify the voices of the women in our network. Similarly, some new things that we're taking on are publishing a white paper that outlines the advocacy demands that the youth in our network made in all the advocacy circles that we hosted with our MPs and the ones that we're hosting in the future. That'll function as an accountability mechanism, ideally. But also I think there's various like practical skills that young people in particular need to know, whether that's like how to build a professional network, to know your rights in the workplace so that when you are facing discrimination, you know where to go, when you know the support networks that are available to you, basic things like how to write a CV, how to write a resume, how to ask for a reference, things like that are, I think, really kind of the building blocks of entering the economy per se, that young folks who are graduating might not have a lot of experience with. So I think part of what NCUF is working on is both the higher level advocacy strategies and building partnerships, but also some of the more foundational skill building things that young folks need to be successful in going for the professional opportunities that they dream of.
Thank you so much, Abby. Magnolia, over to you.
Thanks. I'll try to be short. For me, I see my work, kind of 4 pillars. We do access to capital, capacity development for both entrepreneurs, but also for our network that we support, advocacy work, and then of course partnerships. So for capital right now, what's really important for us is ensuring long-term funding for our Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Program. We want to make sure this program's here to stay. Also, Sophia, just touching on what you said around, reliance on government. NACA launched our Indigenous Growth Fund, which is the newest and largest Indigenous social impact fund in Canada. And so we're really excited about that, because that'll allow institutional and social impact investors and provide them with a vehicle to directly contribute to economic reconciliation. So that's a really big focus for us as an organization. For capacity development, it's ensuring, so even with our women's program and all of our frontline staff at our member organizations, ensuring that they're provided with the training that they need to do their jobs well. And we need to make sure we take care of them, because ultimately they're the ones supporting our end users, the entrepreneurs. So it's important that we're providing kind of that support at every level. And of course, this all ties into our advocacy work. And then with partnerships, we're always looking for partnerships, and partnerships that make sense and that align with our mission and mandate, as an Indigenous organization. And I think other organizations that serve underserved groups, it's really important for us that any programming and supports, for Indigenous by Indigenous, we are the experts. And it's really important that we maintain that in the work that we do, and we don't want to compete with others for funding. So let's come together and work together and collaborate. Because with that said, we can't do it all. So how can we support one another in our missions that are so aligned? So those are kind of the 4 areas I'll leave it at. So thank you.
Thank you, Magnolia. Allison, any final thoughts?
I think that, what's being said. So my goal to make change with Moms at Work, and for those of you who have been familiar, is like, we've done things where we publicly tell people that we pay women to speak, because I'm sure every single person on this panel is constantly asked to speak for free, right? Go do your hair, do the thing, show up at the place, do the prep, do the sound check, do the whatever. And so we have publicly said no over and over and over again, and encouraged other people to do the same thing. And that encourages big organizations to pay women, especially women entrepreneurs. Second thing is that we pay, when we hire, we pay people for the interview process. When people come to interview with us, they might have to get childcare. They might have to get, take some time off work. They may not be able to afford that. So we're trying to change how businesses function. And we're a huge proponent, like we're the OG supporters of pay transparency. I'm like, as one of the quickest ways to help close the wage gap, but it's really showing up and doing these things. And in terms of advocacy, all I tell people, because you see all this stuff with CUPE right now, people are like, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? I'm like, show up. So stop asking what you can do and like show up with a sign. So that's been my takeaway, is like, whatever we're saying, we have to show up and do. And people on the chat were talking about how, it is always women's unpaid labor. People do not value women's time the same way they do men's. And so us pushing back can feel very hard and very dangerous. But I'm in a position to do that so that other people don't have to fight as hard when they're asked to do those things, right? And Teresa's saying like advocacy is not paid work, and yet people who do it are needed, yet often poor and certainly underpaid. I didn't have any money to start my business. I had 6 months to make it work or go back and get a job. Because I can't functionally read, no one will hire me. So I was like, I was on disability, I do those things. So I totally effing get it. Because I'm in a position now with my business, advocacy is a paid part of our business. I pay my staff to do advocacy work. That's why we're so good at it. Because that is totally unacceptable to ask the women in my team, most of who have like gaps in their careers because they had sick children of 5 and 6 years and can't get a job, to be paid and be paid well for that work. So when people ask me how I do it, I said, I do it because our people are paid well to do it, and they show up every single day. So I'm right on side with you in that advocacy is not paid work. It is not valued. Every woman here has gone up against that and has their time not valued at home, at the office, and in these spaces. And I'm hoping that by what we're saying and doing, like that people will change and maybe pay people to show up for a talk, for an event. And it's those small things that like we can really change the dynamic by saying no, but some people aren't in that safe space to say no. And so then we have to rely on other people who are to do that for them.
No, absolutely. And I think as well, like there's the, valuing the time and experience and effort that people bring, and compensating them fairly for that. And then there's also building organizations that might have unlimited sick time, because as parents of kids in daycare and kindergarten, like you're going to be off taking care of your family and having to make the choice of like, okay, I'm going to work with my sick toddler behind me because I can't afford to miss a day of work. So like I think this kind of valuing of women's time and labor like starts with pay equity, and then there are so many other tenets of it that come along with that are just going to feed into this organizational shift that will be more supportive of women and other marginalized communities in the workforce. So Nancy, I'll turn it over to you for a very quick last word.
Okay, so jumping off what Allison said, what CanWCC did at the beginning of this year was to change our membership structure, and we realized that we can't ask people who are experiencing the issues that we're advocating for to pay us to advocate for them. That doesn't make any sense. So we now have a free membership, and that's so that there's no financial barrier to our advocacy. Anyone can join who believes in what we're doing. You just sign up, boom, you're in the community, and we want to hear your voice. We want you to inform our advocacy. And then we have a paid membership that is a straight transaction of, here's some services and stuff. It's a very straight kind of transaction. But when it comes to advocacy, that is something that we want to offer to everyone, and we don't want to put a price tag on that. So that's something that we've implemented to try to change that. And there's no chamber of commerce out there that is doing that kind of thing. So I would really encourage folks who believe in what we're doing, regardless of whether you are a women or women identified or non-binary business owner, to join us, because all voices are important, and we are advocating for economic equity for across the board, across sectors. That's it.
Perfect. And I think we did it. Yeah, please, folks on the panel, drop your organizational, websites in the chat so people can continue to follow up and follow along with the work that you're doing. I'll do a very quick wrap up, recognizing that we're right at 2:30 and folks might need to drop off. That's totally fine. Just want to say a huge thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. As always, this has been a really great way to bring network members, partners, and the broader sector together to discuss and share ways forward. Partnership kept coming up a lot in the conversation today. And, a lot of the work that, folks on the call are doing through their organizations are all grounded in this idea of partnership. The Equal Futures Network, that is at one of the very core pillars of the work that we're doing. So yeah, just keeping that in mind as we're all kind of moving forward to break out of these silos, is that we've got a lot of folks within our respective networks. So there's lots of opportunity to kind of leverage these partnerships. I was super nervous to moderate this conversation because, in all honesty, this is not my area of expertise, but you all made it so easy. And I hope that everybody else is feeling as energized as I am. And I have a lot of gratitude for everybody on the call today. So we look forward to hosting future incubators on a variety of topics in the coming months. We don't want this conversation to end. We'll be thinking of ways to interject and continue to engage in this economic equity space as we start to build programming out for our summit taking place in Whitehorse in May 2023. If you're not already a member of the Equal Futures Network, please join us and sign up to receive our emails. This is where you'll hear about events like this and more information about the summit first. If you have any questions or follow-up for today's session, or if you would like to suggest a future topic of activity, you can reach out to me at efn-rie@camwatch.ca, and I'll put that in the chat as well. Always happy to hear from, people in the network and outside of the network. In the coming days, I'll share an outcome document highlighting some of the key points, resources, recommendations shared in this session, along with the recording. And I just look forward to continuing to connect and collaborate with everybody in the future. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday afternoon.